How would you... Wait. Okay. I am shocked. I make a video discussing the worst torture methods in human history. I describe ways that people were brutally mutilated. And what do you want?
So we saw part 1 yesterday. It was very wholesome.
You wanted more. Well, that's perfectly... We go on. Molten gold torture. This method is extremely simple, but so vile in nature. Now, it's obvious that this torture method involves melted gold, but what's not so obvious is what's done with it. Unfortunately, if you're on the receiving end of this, you're going to have that molten gold poured directly down your throat. Before we discuss what happens to you during this torture method, let's
just like hacking Game of Thrones.
Consider this. Who has all this gold and why are they so extra? They could have chose to use copper, lead, iron, even silver, but no, they chose gold of all things.
Let me see if I know my history right. Didn't, for example, like the Aztecs or some shit do this because the explorers came from the east looking for gold, and this was like, oh, you want gold, huh? Here, I'll give you something to quench your thirst. Look.
This just means that the people doing this torture method had a lot of wealth and they wanted to send a message. So if this method's so awful, why is it the first one on the list? Well, here's my explanation. The amount of suffering you experienced was relatively low. Most victims would be dead within 10 seconds.
Oh.
As soon as the molten lava was poured down your throat, the amount of steam that would be produced by the molten lava on your organs would produce enough pressure to explode vital organs. And if your lungs didn't burst, the thermal injury to your lungs would pretty much cause instant death from pulmonary dysfunction and shock. And if for some reason that didn't kill you, the gold would then harden, causing asphyxiation, which would lead to death. But this was extremely rare. This is brutal. Don't get me wrong. We're just warming up. No pun intended. Waterboarding. I would say waterboarding is probably one of the most well-known methods on...
Waterboarding is so hard to like evaluate in torture because it's so hard to relate to unless you've actually tried it yourself, right? It's so hard to be like to get a feeling for just how bad it is. They all say it feels like drowning, and I mean that's not a good fun feeling. Time to try it on stream.
On this list. Not the most, we'll get into that later, but if you've seen enough movies or any sort of American television, you've probably come across the concept. In case you're unfamiliar, waterboarding is the simple process of having a cloth draped over your face and then having water poured on top.
Let's go waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay, bro.
Would be strapped to
Hang
a table
loose.
which had their feet elevated over their head, and the primary purpose was to extract information. The method itself was simple but extremely effective and was very common because when it gained popularity in medieval times, this was the only torture method that allowed for serious torture without any sort of physical proof. The ironic part is that waterboarding sounds like a really fun summer activity, but it honestly couldn't be further from the truth. So why is this torture method worse than molten gold being poured down your throat? Well, I would say duration. This could go on for days or even weeks if you were unwilling to give the information that they were looking for. And back in medieval times when this was first introduced, people would often drown, and the cloth, which was primarily a safety measure for the victim, was not introduced until much later. In the early versions of this method, they would just pour water directly on your face, which would often lead to the inhalation of water and drowning. Also, not to mention in other cases of early use of this method, they would typically just force feed you water until your stomach exploded. Similar to the Swedish drink, but less gross. If you're unfamiliar with the Swedish drink, watch part 1. Ling Chi. Literally.
If you didn't see last video, the Swedish drink, it was just poop and pee. They just made people drink that. Yeah, not the most creative torture method, but probably pretty efficient.
Translating to lingering death, also known as the death of 1,000 cuts, Ling Chi is absolutely brutal. Most commonly used in China, but also used in places like Vietnam, Ling Chi was the torture method reserved for the most vile of criminals. This method could last from minutes to hours and typically took place in a public setting. The method itself consisted of having the victim be slowly and precisely cut into small pieces, starting with the victim's torso, having their torso slowly cut off until their ribs were exposed. The same procedure would then be applied to their limbs, one by one, exposing bone and removing flesh. The last known instance of this method actually happened on film. Yeah, not that long ago. That situation caused the method to be outlawed weeks later. I don't know about you guys, but having my body cut up slowly in front of a crowd over time definitely doesn't sound fun. Sawing in half. This method is the definition of self-explanatory, but I'm still going to elaborate. Sawing or the saw happens
Nice
to
content,
varying
thank you.
degrees, all depending on your crime. For theft and petty crime, typically you would only lose a finger or a hand. This would be not only a painful punishment for the criminal, but also a huge warning sign to any potential criminals. But we're not talking about just losing a digit or a hand or warning signs.
This worst
We're talking
torture
about
methods
the
in human
worst
history.
case
Not the most wholesome video. Listen, I'm not even the one picking these. I'm just clicking links off my subreddit.
Of this torture method. Sawing in half is exactly how it sounds. The victim was hung upside down by their feet with their legs spread apart. And with a large two-man saw, the victim would be cut in half from their crotch.
Chad, if you want to see this, there's 2 movies I've seen where they do this shit. Bone Tomahawk and The Terrifier, or whatever it's called. Terrifier. So, if you're ever curious, if you want to like... they're pretty graphic, right? I'd say Bone Tomahawk especially. Jesus Christ, that shit's fucked up. Dexter has it as well?
From their crotch to their head. The thought of a thick, serrated blade ripping you in half is honestly disgusting, and it's hard to imagine that there's worse torture methods than this, but once again,
no one fucked with this first time, chatter.
Simply because the life expectancy during this method is low, and the duration of suffering is also low. That is, if they didn't take their time. This next method is honestly too evil to even mention. I know we've discussed some horrible topics, but this is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy.
Shut up about severance!
What I'm about to discuss is shocking, horrible, and if you wanted to leave now, this is your fair warning, and I wouldn't blame you.
He's setting up an ad, right?
Like most of the entries on this list, this was actually a comment on the first video in this series. This method is YouTube with no food. Or should I say, food with no YouTube? Obviously, I'm just lightening the mood, but seriously, it does kind of suck. Tuv commented this on my last video. Now get back to the list. The Judas Cradle. Also known as the Judas Chair.
Thank you, sir.
This method is something out of a twisted BDSM nightmare. The 2 most common examples of the Judas Chair are a 3-legged stool with a pointed top or a 4-legged bench with a slanted triangular top. I'm not sure if one is really any better than the other, but they both serve the same purpose. The goal was intelligence collection, and the execution of both depictions of this device were the same. The victim, typically stripped naked, would be placed on top of the Judas chair, typically specifically positioned on their rear. Their body weight alone would instantly cause extreme discomfort due to their unfortunate seating position. But that's only the beginning. The Judas chair was often lubricated to allow for smoother entry of the spiked top or even more discomfort on the slanted top. That alone is horrible, but still, we haven't even scratched the surface. Once the interrogation began, the victim would have pressure applied to their legs, typically in the form of weights, pulling them down. The victim would slowly feel their body being penetrated and slowly ripped apart. Those performing this method could alleviate and apply pressure on and off consistently to cause more and more severe pain. Victims could also
True, Chad. You gotta pick one, the pointy or the slanted one. I feel like I would pick the pointy one. The slanted one, I feel like is more, that's almost like being cut in half again. The slanted one, I feel like because it has more sides, the pressure is more distributed, but I don't think that actually applies. I mean, either way, you're fucked.
Left on this device by themselves, slowly feeling their body give way below their weight. This torture method can become fatal when vital organs have been reached or blood losses became too much. But even if you were spared...
Why don't we have like an emote that sort of makes this expression? I mean, that's sort of... what? I guess.
And didn't immediately...
Colon D is more... it's not quite the same, but it's similar. It's a good face. The Mother of God face. We used to have an emote like that. The Jesus Christ, how horrifying. Sorry for the sidetracking. It's not quite the same, right? But you guys remember this meme? I used to have this guy as an emote. Jesus Christ, how horrifying. All right.
Have been reached or blood losses became too much. But even if you were spared and didn't immediately die on the device, typically enough damage was done to cause severe infections, which would soon set in and cause death. To me, this device is very similar to the saw, but worse, because it's your body weight being used against you, and it's not a sharp saw, but a slow, dull edge that's ripping you apart during a much longer period. To be frank, I don't want to spike up my butt, but to each their own. the brazen bull.
Oh, there
This
it
was
is. I brought this one up in the previous video.
by far the most commented method from the first video. You guys were so upset that I didn't mention the brazen bull that I almost had to make this entire video just to mention it. And don't get me wrong, it's brutal. And I'm glad you guys informed me. It's my job to give you guys what you want. And you know I always give you what you want. So let's get right into it. Created by the ancient Greeks, the brazen bull is well documented in ancient Greek literature and is one of the worst, if not the worst torture method of all time. The individual who created the brazen bull was actually an inventor by trade, and he actually pitched the idea to potential investors to raise funds to create it. Could you imagine just watching an episode of ancient Greek Shark Tank and an engineer just pulls up pitching the most horrible torture device of all time? Sharks,
Now that's
I am
content.
looking for a 10 shekel investment on my new torture device. I call it the burning bull. We need to make a big wooden bowl that we can put people inside of and burn. Actually, that's going to be too expensive because the bowl is going to burn and you're going to have to make a lot of wooden bowls. And that's a lot of money. Why don't you make it bronze? It looks shiny and you can use it to kill everybody.
Oh,
I love that
perfect.
idea. Will you partner with me? Better idea. I'm going to steal the idea and you're going to die. Guards, kill him, please. History lesson aside, how did the bull actually work? The brazen bull
I've
was
heard of this too. Apparently the inventor was killed using the thing. The guy he pitched it to wanted to see if it worked, so he just killed the guy that made it. I don't know if it's true or not, but
a life-size
what I heard.
bronze cast bull with an opening on the side. This is how the victim got in. As soon as the victim was placed on the inside, a fire was lit underneath, roasting the victim alive. If that wasn't bad enough, there was also special devices inputted to make it a spectacle for a crowd. First of which being pipes on the inside to make the screams of the victim amplified on the outside. And secondly, the steam escape was the bull's nose for visual effect. As the victim would die on the inside of the brazen bull, the bull itself would seem to come alive. Slowly feeling the tomb you're encased in get warmer
imagine
and
the
warmer
smell.
would be awful.
How do you clean it? Maybe they don't.
Being burned alive is one of the worst regarded ways of dying ever. So I don't think it's much of a question of why this is so high on the list.
Didn't the pipes also sort of make it sound like a bull? There's a scene where someone there's a movie. Which one is it? Is it the one with Henry Cavill in it? Where someone actually dies in one of these?
So, fun fact, both the inventor and the funder of the brazen bull were both executed
Immortals.
via the brazen bull. Really came full circle. Crucifixion. When I
Immortals,
mentioned
brazen
earlier,
bull.
most well-known torture methods, this is exactly. In case you're not following, in the Bible, Jesus Christ was a victim of this torture method. And that's also why the cross is such a significant symbol in the Christian religion. There's a pretty broad level of variation between how crucifixions were performed, but the industry standard, if you will, goes like this. The victim would be laid on a cross, having their arms extended on each side. A long 5 to 7 inch nail would be pierced either through their palms or through their wrist, securing the victim to the cross.
Through their
along with
wrist when they
additional
insta-die?
nails securing their heels to the lower end of the cross. In some tame examples, the cross would at that point be stood up and the victim would be left to die a slow, agonizing death, having their body stretched apart underneath their own body.
Wait, he said the heels. I thought they put the nails like at the front of the foot. A nail through your heel sounds really painful.
Weight. But like the other entries on this list, it can get a lot worse. A small detail to note is that when being crucified, your limbs are always slightly bent to prevent you from using them for any sort of leverage and to maximize discomfort. The life expectancy of someone being crucified is anywhere from a few hours to a few days, and typically dependent on your environment and also what happened before your crucifixion. Most victims of crucifixion were beaten severely before they were hung up. And most crucifixion victims were not in ideal environments. From the pain of all the weight of your body pulling on
this to the
nails in
wheel?
your hands, to the pain of your body weight pulling the shoulders out of their sockets, expanding your chest cavity and causing asphyxiation, there is absolutely nothing pleasant about crucifixion.
You know,
In
some
my-
people do this on purpose, right? What is it, like in Spain or some shit? There's like a tradition. I mean, it's not Spain, South America. People get crucified on purpose to, like, I don't know, pay tribute. The Philippines, is it?
In my opinion, one of the worst parts is the length.
Well, they get crucified. They get like a tamer version, of course. Well, they'll still put nails through their hands. Can't remember if they put them through their feet as well.
Duration of this.
Passion of
Sometimes
Christ for
crucifixion
movie
victims would be
nights.
alive
Pass.
so long in this agonizing state that guards would just stab them through their heart to kill them because they wouldn't die quick enough. Crucifixion was awful. And with that being said,
Crucifixion!
let me know what you guys consider to be the
Good.
worst torture
Next.
method on
Crucifixion.
this list. I was really struggling to figure out which one I
Okay,
found.
thanks, weird crucify torture guy, man. That was moderately interesting, I guess.
There's a best of internet daily dotes. There's the new unusual memes. This thing looks insane.